This documentary is based on court records and verified reporting. Allegations are clearly identified and no facts have been invented. It was just after sunrise in Jalva Vihar, a residential complex in what the BBC would later describe as an affluent suburb on the outskirts of Delhi. Inside flat L32, a door was forced open. On the other side of that door lay 13-year-old Aarushi Talwar. She was found in her bedroom, in her own bed. Her throat had been cut. There are injuries to her head consistent with blunt force trauma. Her father, Dr. Rajesh Talwar, had entered the room that morning after she did not respond. He was the one who saw her first. He raised the alarm. Police were called. At that moment, one person was missing. Hemraj Banjade. The family's living domestic worker could not be found anywhere inside the flat. Initially, investigators believed he had fled. But the following day, May 17th, police unlocked the terrace door of the same building. Hemraj's body was lying there. He had suffered similar injuries, blunt force trauma, a deep wound to the throat. Now, there were two victims, killed under the same roof on the same night. There were no signs of forced entry, and within hours, accusations began. They would shift, they would collapse, they would harden into public belief. There would be three investigative approaches: a conviction, life sentences, and 4 years in prison. And then, in 2017, a complete acquittal by Allahabad High Court. But before the verdict, before the media storm, and before the narrative turned into something almost cinematic, we need to slow down. Because what happened inside that apartment on the night of May 15th, 2008 remains legally unresolved, and the court record tells a story far more complex than the headlines ever did. This is the story of Aarushi Talwar and Hemraj Banjade. Aarushi Talwar was 13 years old. The High Court refers to her simply as the only teenage daughter of Rajesh and Nupu Talwar, an only child. She attended Delhi Public School in Noida. She lived in that flat with her parents and the domestic worker who would later be found dead as well. On the evening of May 15th, according to the prosecution's reconstruction, which was reviewed by the High Court, the family had dinner together. Nothing unusual was reported, and Aarushi went to her bedroom to sleep. She did not wake up the next morning. The medical findings, which was later examined in court, confirmed two categories of injuries: a blunt force trauma to the head and a deep incised wound to the throat. Those are established facts. What the record does not capture is the ordinary rhythm of a 13-year-old's life, with school, routine, and her expectations. It does not tell us what she was thinking when she went to sleep that night. It only tells us how that night ended. And within hours, the focus of suspicion would begin to shift in ways that would define this case for years. Hemraj Banjade was a Nepalese national working as a living domestic employee for the Talwar family. He lived in the same flat and shared the same space where the murders occurred. When Aarushi's body was discovered on the morning of May 16th, Hemraj was absent. His disappearance immediately shaped the early direction of the investigation. But by the following day, he was no longer a suspect. He was the second victim. His body lay on the terrace of the building, undiscovered for more than 24 hours. In the years that followed, much of the public debate focused on the Talwar family. Far less attention was given to Hemraj, a man who left his home country for work and whose life ended in the same act of violence. 2 people were killed that night. Both remain without a judicially determined perpetrator. In the hours after Aarushi's body was discovered, police officers moved through the flat. Neighbors gathered outside. Relatives began arriving. Reporters started asking questions. At first glance, it appeared to be a contained crime scene. A closed apartment, a limited number of people inside. Hemraj was missing, and so the early narrative formed quickly. But beneath that surface, something else was happening. The flat was not immediately sealed. People moved in and out. Family members entered rooms. Visitors gathered. And as the day progressed, the numbers of individuals inside the apartment increased. At the time, it may have seemed ordinary, the natural chaos that follows sudden tragedy. But years later, when the Allahabad High Court examined the record, it would describe serious lapses in how the scene was preserved. And those early hours would become critically important because in cases built entirely on circumstantial evidence, the integrity of the crime scene is everything. And here, that integrity was already compromised. As Hemraj remained missing, suspicion settled on him almost immediately. Police publicly named him as the prime suspect in Aarushi's murder. The idea seemed logical on the surface. He was absent. He had lived in the same flat. There were no signs of forced entry. But that conclusion would not survive 24 hours. Because on May 17th, officers opened the terrace door and everything changed. Hemraj's body was found lying there. He had suffered blunt force trauma and a deep incised wound to the throat, injuries strikingly similar to Aarushi's. The man who had been accused was now the second victim, and with that discovery, the first narrative collapsed. What replaced it would be even more explosive. With Hemraj now identified as the second victim, the investigation pivoted sharply. The missing suspect had become a corpse, and within hours, a new theory began circulating. Police suggested that Rajesh Talwar had discovered Aarushi and Hemraj together in what they described as a compromising situation. The implication was immediate, and the suggestion was devastating. According to this theory, the father had reacted in rage, killing both his daughter and the domestic worker. It was an allegation that moved faster than the investigation itself. It was reported widely, debated on television panels, repeated in headlines, and for many members of the public, it hardened quickly into belief. But at that stage, it was still a theory. No charges had yet been proven, no trial had taken place, and no court had tested the evidence. And yet, the narrative had already taken hold. Years later, the Allahabad High Court would examine that theory carefully, and it would find the evidence insufficient to sustain a conviction on that basis. But in 2008, that conclusion was still far away. At that moment, the country was watching, and the story was only beginning to fracture. At first, the accusation seemed decisive. A contained apartment with no signs of forced entry and only the family inside. But as the hours turned into days, details began to surface that complicated that neat conclusion. The crime scene had not been immediately sealed. Neighbors and relatives entered the flat. People moved through rooms before full forensic processing had taken place. Media presence also grew rapidly. And at the time, it may have seemed like ordinary confusion following tragedy. But in cases built entirely on circumstantial evidence, those first hours matter more than anything else. And years later, when the Allahabad High Court reviewed the record, it would describe serious lapses in the handling of that case. Hemraj's body had laid undiscovered on the terrace for more than 24 hours. That fact alone would raise uncomfortable questions. If investigators had missed a body on the same premises, what else might have been missed? What evidence might have been altered, moved, contaminated, either intentionally or unintentionally? The foundation of the case was already unstable, and the investigation changed hands. Public pressure mounted quickly, and the investigation was transferred to the Central Bureau of Investigation, the CBI, India's federal investigative agency. The first CBI team did not continue with the parental rage theory. Instead, it proposed something entirely different. According to reporting that was later examined in court, this team suggested that Rajesh Talwar's professional assistant, along with 2 other domestic workers, may have been involved in both killings during a failed sexual assault. It was a dramatic shift, and it was pursued in part through narco analysis testing, a controversial procedure involving chemical agents administered during questioning. The reliability and admissibility of such material has long been debated. The Allahabad High Court would later criticize the reliance on narco analysis evidence during this phase of the investigation. Eventually, that theory collapsed as well. A second CBI team took over, and the direction shifted again. The servants' theory was abandoned. The focus returned to the Talwars. 3 investigations, 3 different narratives, none conclusively proven, and still no direct evidence. In 2010, the second CBI team filed what is known as a closure report. Rajesh Talwar was named as the main suspect, but the report concluded that there was insufficient evidence to file charges. That's important. Suspicion, according to the CBI at that stage, did not meet the threshold required for prosecution. The case, it seemed, might quietly end there, but it didn't, because in February 2011, a special CBI court rejected the closure report. The judge took independent cognizance of the matter. Rajesh and Nupur Talwar were summoned to stand trial, and suddenly, what had nearly faded from momentum was back at the center of national attention. The trial that followed was built entirely on circumstantial evidence. There were no eyewitnesses, no direct forensic material conclusively linking the accused to the act of killing. The prosecution argued that the murders occurred inside a locked flat and that the parents were the only adults present. They pointed to the alleged weapons, a golf club belonging to Rajesh Talwar, and a sharp instrument consistent with surgical or dental use. They argued that the crime scene had been tampered with, and they relied heavily on the theory of dishonored family. The allegation that Rajesh Talwar had acted in rage after discovering his daughter and Hemraj together. In November 2013, the special CBI court convicted both Rajesh and Nupur Talwar. They were sentenced to life imprisonment. The CBI had sought the death penalty. The court declined, but the verdict was decisive. For many, it appeared that the mystery had been resolved. The parents were guilty. The narrative that had dominated headlines for 5 years seemed confirmed, and the Talwars went to prison. For nearly 4 years, that conviction stood until 2017. On October 12, 2017, the Allahabad High Court delivered its judgment on appeal, and it dismantled the conviction. The court allowed both appeals. It set aside the verdict in its entirety. Rajesh and Nupur Talwar were acquitted of all charges. The reasoning was precise. In criminal law, guilt must be proven beyond reasonable doubt. In cases based purely on circumstantial evidence, the chain must be complete, consistent only with guilt, and excluding every other reasonable possibility. The High Court found that the prosecution had failed to establish such a chain. It criticized the reasoning of the trial court. It found that key forensic conclusions were not supported conclusively by the material on record. It found that alternative possibilities had not been ruled out, and it emphasized a principle that sits at the heart of criminal justice. Suspicion, however strong, cannot replace proof. With that, the Talwars walked free. But the acquittal did not answer the central question. If not them, then who? The High Court did not name an alternative perpetrator. It did not reconstruct a definitive account of what happened that night. It ruled only on what had been proven, and according to the court, it had not been proven beyond reasonable doubt. Legally, the murders remain unsolved. On the night of May 15, 2008, 2 people were killed inside a flat in Noida. Aarushi Talwar was 13 years old. Hemraj Banjade lived and worked in that same home. The legal system produced a conviction. Then it produced an acquittal. What it did not produce was certainty. The record shows early investigative lapses, shifting theories, competing narratives, and a case built entirely on circumstantial evidence. The Allahabad High Court found that the burden of proof had not been met. That is the legal position. But the question of what truly happened inside flat L32 that night remains unanswered. This was the case of Aarushi Talwar and Hemraj Banjade, and nearly 2 decades later, it remains unresolved. Our hearts go out to the families and loved ones affected. Thanks for watching Criminal Cadence. Please like, share, and subscribe. Let us know your thoughts in the comments.